I want you to imagine just for a second the map of Europe back in the 13th and 14th centuries.
Right, yeah.
Just picture the borders in your head, because by this point, practically the entire continent has been, swept by Christianity.
Oh, really?
You've got these powerful kings, these massive sprawling empires, the huge stone cathedrals stretching up toward the sky. And it looks like this monolithic block of shared religion and culture, except for one famous, incredibly stubborn holdout right in the middle of the Baltic region.
Lithuania.
Exactly, Lithuania. Europe's absolute last officially pagan state, a place that literally held onto its old gods and just fiercely resisted official conversion to Catholicism until, 1387?
Yeah, 1387.
Yeah.
Which is, incredibly late.
Right. But as we found out reading a recent breakdown from Cambridge University Press and the journal Antiquity for today's deep dive, the borders on a map rarely tell the full story of the actual people walking those streets.
No, they really don't. And I think it's a super common trap to look at history from that bird's eye view.
Oh, for sure.
When we think of a pagan stronghold like medieval Lithuania, especially surrounded by hostile forces like the Teutonic Knights, we just tend to picture an isolated, impenetrable fortress.
Like they locked the gates and that was it.
Exactly. We assume the people living there were completely cut off from the rest of the world, just, guarding their ancient traditions against outsiders. But the archaeological reality on the ground is far more complex. And frankly, it's much more fascinating.
Which is exactly what we're getting to today, because we are basically launching a true crime-style forensic investigation here.
I love that framing.
Yeah. But instead of a modern crime scene, we are looking at a 700-year-old mystery. Our mission with this deep dive is to unearth the hidden, diverse reality of medieval Vilnius by looking at the literal bones of its earliest inhabitants.
And the actual physical evidence.
Exactly. We're going to see how this cutting-edge science completely shatters our assumptions about how isolated this pagan capital really was, and to understand who these mysterious people were. We first have to look at how they were buried in a city that officially did not share their faith.
Right. And the focal point of this whole research paper is a very specific location. It's the Bokuto Street Cemetery, which is situated right in Vilnius Old Town.
Okay.
Now, to set the scene, in the 13th and 14th centuries, the standard local Lithuanian practice was pagan cremation.
So burning the bodies.
Right, cremation. That was the deeply ingrained cultural norm. You'd expect to dig there and find ashes. But when archaeologists excavated the Bokuto Cemetery, they found 532 intact graves that they defied the local customs entirely.
Which is wild, because right in the middle of the pagan capital, they find hundreds of inhumations, like bodies buried fully intact, lying supine, facing east-west. Yeah. And reading through the research, I was struck by how this wasn't just some, subtle deviation. This is a classic Christian burial tradition happening right out in the open, in a city that is fiercely defending its pagan identity against crusaders.
It represents a massive cultural anomaly. I mean, it really does. And the physical position of the bodies, that was only the first clue.
Oh, right, the artifacts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because in about 10% of these graves, researchers uncovered this extraordinary collection of grave goods that just further complicated the whole picture. We're talking about artifacts that clearly belong to the Byzantine cultural sphere.
The descriptions of these items are just incredible. They found cowrie shells.
Which is crazy to find there.
Right, because those would have had to travel across vast trade networks all the way from the Indian Ocean.
Yeah.
And they found these intricately crafted glass pendants, amber crosses, there were metal encolpions.
Like reliquary crosses worn on the chest.
Right. And perhaps most importantly, they found these fascinating head ornaments called chaplets.
Yes.
Yeah.
Chaplets.
I just want you to try to picture one of these. It's a band of leather, intricately woven and sewn with metal threads, designed to be attached to a fabric headdress. Imagine how striking that would look glinting in the firelight of a medieval Vilnius street.
Oh, absolutely.
It would immediately mark the wearer as someone connected to a totally different world.
And the chaplets are a critical piece of evidence here, because the fashion for wearing them did not originate in the Baltics. It reached Vilnius from the region of Halych-Solinia, which corresponds to modern-day Western Ukraine and southern Poland.
Okay.
Historically, that territory was part of the Kievan Russes. So when you combine the chaplets, the Byzantine ornaments, and that east-west burial alignment, All of these elements strongly connect the individuals at Bokoto to the Orthodox Christian community.
Which the sources call the Civitas Ruthenica.
Exactly. That specific community.
Now, I have to push back here for a second, because this is where the history gets muddy for me.
Go ahead.
If I'm a local pagan living in Vilnius, right, and I see wealthy merchants passing through with gorgeous Byzantine jewelry or like a fancy Ukrainian headpiece, I might just want to buy one for myself.
Right. Fashion is fashion.
Yeah. So does finding a cross necklace or a chaplet in a grave actually prove that the person physically migrated hundreds of miles from the Kievan Rus' to Vilnius? Like, couldn't they just be local pagans with a taste for foreign fashion?
That is the central dilemma of traditional archaeology. You hit the nail on the head.
Okay, phew.
Because artifacts are highly mobile. They tell us about trade routes, fashion trends, diplomatic gift-giving, all of that. But you are completely right. Looking at the objects in a grave cannot definitively tell us if the human being in that grave ever stepped foot outside of Vilnius.
Right, they could have just bought it at the market.
Precisely. To prove physical migration, you have to look past the grave goods. You have to look inside the skeletal structure itself. Because while artifacts can be traded across borders, a person's biological signature cannot.
And this is where the methodology of the antiquity paper completely blew my mind. The science here is just...
Wow, it really is.
They used a technique called multi-tissue isotope analysis. And I want to spend some time on this because it's basically a masterclass in forensic science. They didn't just test a random bone and call it a day.
No, they were incredibly thorough.
Yeah, they tested 3 different parts of the human body to reconstruct an actual chronological timeline of a single person's life.
Right, because our bodies essentially function as biological diaries. We literally are what we eat, what we drink, and where we live, down to a microscopic chemical level.
It's wild to think about.
It is. So the researchers focused on measuring different isotopes within human tissue. And let's start with how they analyze childhood. To do that, they specifically look at the second permanent molar.
Okay, wait, let me offer an analogy here to see if I'm visualizing this correctly.
Go for it.
It seems like every skeleton they dug up is essentially carrying 2 distinct forms of identification. Your teeth act like your childhood passport, covered in stamps from the exact region where you were born and what you were eating back then. And your femur, your leg bone, acts like your adult residency card, showing where you ended up living and eating in the years right before you died. Does that make sense?
That passport analogy is actually perfect.
Yeah.
It captures the mechanism perfectly. And the reason we can read that childhood passport is because of how dentine forms.
Dentine being the inside of the tooth.
Exactly. The dentine in your second molar develops during a very specific window of your life, between the ages of 3 and 8 years old.
Oh, wow. That's specific.
Yes. And crucially, once dentine forms, it never remodels. It is locked in forever.
Like a time capsule.
Exactly like a time capsule. By measuring the carbon and nitrogen isotopes trapped in that dentine, scientists can determine your diet during those exact childhood years.
How does that work?
Well, nitrogen levels, for instance, rise as you move up the food chain, so they reveal if a child was eating a diet heavy in meat or fish, or if they were primarily subsisting on plants.
Okay, so the dentine is the food log. That makes sense. But you also mentioned they can track the physical location where the person lived during childhood. How does a tooth tell you GPS coordinates?
For the location data, they look at the enamel on that same molar, which also forms and locks during that 3 to 8-year-old window.
Okay.
Here, they measure strontium and oxygen isotopes. And strontium is particularly brilliant for tracking location.
Why is that?
Because it exists in the local bedrock of the Earth. As rocks weather over thousands of years, strontium enters the soil, it gets absorbed by the local plants, eaten by local animals, and eventually makes its way into your body through your food and water.
And then it just stays there.
Yep. It literally replaces calcium in your tooth enamel.
Okay, so if you grew up in an area with like ancient granite bedrock, your tooth enamel is going to have a totally different strontium signature than someone who grew up on top of young limestone.
Precisely. It acts as a geographical fingerprint. And oxygen isotopes do something similar, but they reflect the local water sources and the general climate of the region where you spent your childhood. So between the dentine and the enamel, we have a complete picture of a person's early life.
Okay, so that's the childhood passport from ages 3 to 8. But to get the adult residency card, the researchers turned to the femur. Why the leg bone?
Well, unlike teeth, bone collagen is dynamic. It constantly remodels itself throughout your life. It's always breaking down old tissue and building new tissue to repair microfractures.
Right, because you're walking on it all the time.
Exactly. Because of this continuous turnover, the isotopic signature in your femur reflects your diet and environment in the last few years leading up to your death.
So, like, if we were to test your teeth and your femur right now, we could map out your life journey.
We absolutely could.
If you moved from New York to London when you were 12, your teeth would scream, North America, but your leg bones would reflect the water and food of the UK.
That's exactly how it works.
So the researchers apply this two-passport check to 15 individuals buried in the Buckwheat cemetery. And when I got to this part of the data, the results for one specific teenager just jumped off the page. Let's talk about grave 311.
Well, grave 311 is fascinating. This is the outlier that forces us to rethink the entire history of the city.
Yeah.
We are looking at a young man who was about 18 years old when he died. And when the researchers tested his bone collagen,
His adult residency card.
right, it showed a standard local Vilnius diet. In the years before his death, he was eating what everyone else in the city was eating.
But his childhood passport told a completely different story.
A radically different story. His dentine showed a childhood diet that was extremely high in C4 plants, specifically millet.
Okay.
It also indicated a much higher intake of meat, dairy, or fish than the local kids in Vilnius were receiving. And when they checked the strontium and oxygen levels in his enamel, they completely mismatched the local Vilnius baseline.
They didn't match at all.
Not at all. His childhood geographic fingerprint perfectly matched territories much further south, regions corresponding to the heartland of the former Kievan Roses in modern-day Ukraine or southern Poland.
Okay, I have to stop you at the millet because I really want to make sure I understand the mechanism here.
Sure.
The paper points to millet as the smoking gun for migration. But why does a specific grain matter so much? I mean, if I eat a bowl of rice in London, it doesn't biologically prove I grew up in Asia. So why couldn't a kid in Vilnius just eat a bowl of millet?
It's a great question, and it comes down to the mechanics of photosynthesis and historical ecology.
Oh, getting into the biology now.
Just a little bit. So millet is a C4 plant, which means it uses a different photosynthetic pathway to process sunlight and carbon dioxide compared to C3 plants like wheat or rye.
Okay.
Because of how it processes carbon, a C4 plant concentrates heavier carbon-13 isotopes. So when you eat a lot of millet, that heavy carbon signature gets permanently locked into your bone structure. We can literally measure how heavy the carbon in a skeleton is.
Okay, that explains the chemical signature. I get that. But why couldn't he just eat millet in Vilnius? Did they just not like it?
No, it's because the climate at the time made it physically impossible to grow there. Yeah. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Earth was experiencing a profound climate shift known as the Little Ice Age. Temperatures across northern Europe were rapidly dropping.
Right, right.
And because millet requires a warmer, longer growing season to thrive, it had completely disappeared from the agricultural systems in the territory of modern-day Lithuania.
So the locals couldn't grow it even if they wanted to. They had to rely on cold weather crops.
Exactly. The local agricultural economy in Vilnius had shifted entirely to cold-tolerant C3 crops, things like rye and buckwheat. In fact, archaeologists have excavated a burnt-down medieval granary in this exact neighborhood in Vilnius.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they cataloged thousands of grains of rye, but they didn't find a single grain of millet. But further south, in the warmer climate of the Kievan Roses, millet was still a staple crop.
Wow. So finding that heavy carbon signature from millet locked in his childhood teeth, it proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this young man grew up hundreds of miles to the south.
Yes.
He lived there until at least age 8, eating a diet the locals in Vilnius couldn't even access before migrating to the pagan capital as a teenager, where his diet eventually switched to the local rye.
It is definitive, irrefutable biological proof of migration.
Oh.
And, he was not the only mobile man identified in the cemetery.
There were others.
Oh, yeah. There was another individual, grave 226, whose strontium levels matched the region of Kernavai, which was the early former capital of Lithuania, located about 40 kilometers away.
Okay.
His burial was particularly striking because he was interred with his legs crossed and surrounded by a stone circle rather than a typical wooden coffin.
Wait, crossed legs?
Yeah, that is a unique style associated with the Yakvingians, which is a totally different Baltic tribe from southern Lithuania.
So we have concrete evidence that men were moving across borders, bringing totally different customs and biological signatures into Vilnius.
Yes, we do.
But the narrative takes a massive twist when we look at the other side of the cemetery, because the researchers ran these exact same multi-tissue isotope tests on the women buried in Brokoto, and a completely different social pattern emerged.
It really did. The isotopic data reveals a stark gender divide.
How so?
Well, unlike the men, almost all the women buried in this Orthodox Christian cemetery were biologically local to the Vilnius region. Their teeth and their femurs showed they grew up locally, ate local diets their entire lives, and had the local strontium fingerprint.
Huh. But wait, I remember reading a detail about the grave goods that makes this even more complex. Some of these local female graves contain items typically associated with pagan traditions.
Yes, which is an incredible juxtaposition. I mean, in a strict Christian burial of this era, you generally do not expect to see grave goods at all, let alone pagan-associated items.
Right.
Yet here we have local women buried with artifacts tied to pagan customs, but placed in supine east-west positions in a clearly designated Orthodox Christian cemetery.
Okay, hold on. Let's think about the implications of this.
I'll do it.
If the women were local pagans, why are they buried in a strict Orthodox Christian cemetery alongside migrant men from Ukraine and Poland? The paper suggests a fascinating synthesis here. Are we looking at evidence that these migrant men moved to Vilnius, married the local pagan women, and that's how the Orthodox religion started to gain a foothold?
That is exactly the compelling conclusion the researchers draw. What we are seeing in the isotopic data is the biological footprint of a highly specific form of social mobility and cultural integration.
Wow.
It points to a community fundamentally shaped by intermarriage.
I mean, just imagine that dynamic at the dinner table for a second.
Right.
You have a husband who grew up in the warm climate of the Kievan Rus', eating millet, wearing Byzantine fashions, attending Orthodox liturgy, and he's sitting across from a wife who grew up in the cold Baltic forests, foraging local rye and following the old Baltic gods, and yet they are integrating their lives.
It completely humanizes this abstract historical era. It shows that the adoption of Christianity wasn't necessarily, some top-down decree forcing everyone to convert at sword point.
Right, it wasn't just crusaders and kings.
Exactly. It was deeply personal. Local women were likely adopting elements of Christianity through their contact and marriages with these migrant men arriving from Orthodox lands. They were bridging the pagan-Christian divide at the most intimate level, decades before the Lithuanian state officially converted.
And there is one specific detail from the source material that basically cements this idea of domestic integration for me. It involves grave 312.
Ah, yes, the double burial.
Yeah, so 312 was a female burial. Her diet was actually a bit of an outlier for the women. She showed signs of eating some of those warmer weather C4 plants as well. But what really struck me was the physical layout of the grave.
It's a key piece of evidence.
She was buried in the exact same pit, placed one on top of the other, with our 18-year-old migrant teenager from grave 311.
That physical proximity is just crucial. Because in Christian burial grounds of this era, it was common practice for members of the same family to be buried in the same grave pit.
Okay.
Now, obviously, we would need ancient DNA testing to confirm their exact relationship with absolute certainty. But the shared grave strongly implies that the immigrant teenager in 311 and the local woman in 312 were related, highly likely by marriage.
This biological record of integration completely reshapes how we view the political and social history of Europe's last pagan stronghold.
It completely flips the script.
It wasn't some walled-off fortress holding out against the world. It was porous. It was dynamic. So, zooming out to the macro level for a bit, what were the historical drivers actually pushing and pulling these people across borders into Vilnius in the first place?
Well, there's a sequence of major historical factors driving this migration. Chronologically, the first major driver was political and diplomatic.
Like alliances.
Exactly. In the late 13th century, Lithuanian dukes like Traidenis and Vilnius maintained very close contact with the Halych-Vilnia region. They were forming strategic alliances to counter the threat of the Teutonic Knights. And, with alliances comes the inevitable movement of people. Diplomats, soldiers, their retinues, all of that.
So, following those political alliances, you have the deliberate economic push. I'm thinking of Grand Duke Gediminas, who essentially sent out medieval PR letters in 1323.
Yes. The Gediminas letters are a landmark historical text. He wrote to various cities across Europe, explicitly inviting merchants, artisans, and tradespeople to come and settle in Vilnius.
Just a mass invite.
Basically. He promised them favorable economic conditions and, crucially, religious freedom. He was actively engineering a cosmopolitan hub to boost the local economy and integrate his pagan state into the broader European trade network.
So if you're a merchant reading Gediminas' letters, you might be tempted by the economics. But a few decades later, the motivation to move to Vilnius probably shifted from economics to pure survival, right?
Yeah.
Because we have to factor in the Black Death.
We definitely do. The mid-14th century was catastrophic for Western and Southern Europe. The bubonic plague decimated populations. However, research indicates that Eastern Europe, and specifically the Baltic region, was generally less affected by the initial waves of the plague.
Really? Why was that?
Partly due to regional trade isolation and generally less dense populations. So it's highly probable that some of this later migration was driven by people literally fleeing the devastation, effectively turning Vilnius into an accidental sanctuary city.
Wow. It just means our entire mental image of Vilnius needs an update. It wasn't just some dark, isolated pagan forest.
Not at all.
From its very beginning, it was this diverse, vibrant hub where people were fleeing plagues, seeking new trade routes, bringing in foreign fashions, and just blending their cultures together.
That is the core revelation of this research. The medieval city, even one entrenched in a fiercely pagan state, was fundamentally built on mobility and adaptation. And this discovery points directly to the future of Baltic archaeology. Because scientists were able to uncover these migrant outliers using multi-tissue isotope analysis, it proves that traditional excavation is no longer enough.
Right. Now that they know the biological data is there, it changes the requirements for how they dig and analyze.
Exactly. It creates an urgent need for new infrastructure. We mentioned earlier that a strontium signature acts as a GPS coordinate based on the local bedrock.
Yeah, the geographic fingerprint.
Right. The challenge is that right now our master strontium map for Eastern Europe is incomplete. We have the coordinates extracted from the teeth of these ancient people, but we lack the comprehensive geographical map to plug those coordinates into.
Oh, so the future of archaeology isn't just about finding the artifacts, it's about actually building the map.
Yes. Future archaeology in the Baltic region will require massive international chemical databases. We need to map the chemical signatures of the soil, the bedrock, and the water across the entire continent.
That sounds like a massive undertaking.
It is. But only then can we trace exactly how our ancestors moved across the landscape with pinpoint accuracy. We are moving from identifying chaplets in the dirt to mapping ancient human mobility on a grand scale.
It's literally turning bones into big data.
It really is.
It's absolutely incredible to think about how much information is locked away in a single tooth.
Oh, wait.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Buckwheat Cemetery and the hidden secrets held within the bones of its people.
It was a pleasure.
We started by looking at Europe's last pagan state as a monolith, but through the science, we found something much more complicated and much more human underneath.
The isotopic data always brings us back to the human element. It reminds us that history is made by individuals.
It really does. And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Think about what this means for our understanding of history. The sources we looked at today show that Christianity likely took root in this early Vilnius community, not through top-down royal decrees or massive battles or violent crusades. It happened through quiet domestic partnerships. A local pagan woman marrying an immigrant Orthodox man, blending their lives and their traditions under one roof. It makes you wonder how many other massive cultural, religious, and political shifts throughout human history were actually driven by everyday romance, family ties, and people just trying to build a life together.
A great question.
These are the shifts that are often completely ignored by the history books, but as we've seen today, they are written right there in our bones.